Hey guys, what is up and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are going to be taking an extended look at Yuzu, the Nintendo Switch Emulator, from a game compatibility and performance standpoint. So if you haven't seen any of my Nintendo Switch Emulator coverage in the past month or two, there are now two Switch emulators currently in development, one called Ryujinx, which I have covered fairly extensively in the past few days, and this one which I am covering now called Yuzu. If you have ever used Citra, the Nintendo 3DS emulator, this user interface will be very familiar to you. Coming up to the file option, you can see we have the option to load folder, load file, set our game directory, and set our recent files. Due to the fact that I haven't renamed any of my decrypted files for any of my games, these are all very confusing to use, so I just use the main UI. You can also see that we have an enable docked mode feature. This is quite useful in games like Stardew Valley due to the fact that if you do not run it in docked mode, practically all of the game will be rendered upside down. We also have this UI option for enabling multicore, however this option is not yet usable, it's only a placeholder UI element. When we move across to the System tab, it is another area that will be very familiar to Citra users. It is practically the exact same layout. Moving across to the Input tab, this will also be very familiar to you, offering a very easy and simple to use mapping scheme. Coming across the graphics, we have a frame rate limiter, and we also have the option to set an internal resolution. You can use auto for your window size, native of 720p, or you can use any of these provided resolutions. Coming across to the Debug tab, we have the usual options which you would expect. These are mostly useful for people who are trying to figure out why their games are crashing or for looking for unimplemented functions. Let's swiftly move along and take a look at some game compatibility and performance. First up, let's take a look at Super Mario Odyssey. While this game does boot and load into its initial splash screen, it even has some basic input support. Unfortunately, after selecting your difficulty, the game will either completely freeze up or crash at this point in time. So before I progress any further, I know a lot of you are going to be wondering if The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Octopath Traveler are booting in this emulator. Unfortunately, at this point in time, neither of these game titles are currently booting in Yuzu. On a positive note, Splatoon 2 is actually booting, however it usually just crashes or freezes completely on this screen you are currently seeing. In a very similar circumstance, 1-2 Switch also boots to this initial splash screen, but unfortunately progresses no further. Cave Story Plus, on the other hand, successfully boots, loads through all of its initial splash screens, loads into the initial in-game menus, and also progresses into game. Performance-wise, in these initial menus, we are getting a locked 60 FPS. You can also see that the UIs are all now correctly rendered. Once we actually progress into game though, there are some fairly funky issues that will happen in this game. Once we have actually loaded into gameplay, you can see that there is a very strange issue with my movement and my character not being able to completely turn around. While this would normally be a minor issue, due to this glitch you are not actually able to interact with doors, health stations, or save points. Due to this input related issue, it is currently not possible to progress past this point. Moving swiftly on to our next game, Deskia 5 currently boots, but unfortunately in all of the builds that I have tested gets stuck in an infinite loop on this loading screen. Next we get to take a look at the first 3D booting title in Yuzu emulator. This title menu in Minecraft Story Mode is the very first rendered 3D in Yuzu emulator. Unfortunately, even though it will load through these screens and progress on into the next menu, this game will unfortunately freeze on this screen and not be able to progress any further. Our next title is One Piece Unlimited World Red. This game currently boots, loads through all of its initial splash screens, and does indeed load into its first in-game menu. Performance-wise on all of these screens, it maintains a fairly consistent 55 or 60 FPS. Unfortunately, in this emulator's current state, once you try to load into a new game in story mode, this title will unfortunately get stuck in an infinite loop on this screen. Let's take a look at our next game, Puyo Puyo Tetris. So while this game does boot and load in game, it currently suffers with fairly poor performance on Yuzu. On my 8700K based PC, the maximum performance I could get in game was about 16 or 17 FPS at any given time. Hopefully in the coming days and weeks this game's performance can be improved, allowing us to maintain a locked 60 FPS in gameplay at all times. Next up, let's take a look at a fan favourite, Sonic Mania. In this title we have another game for this emulator that is very playable indeed. In regular gameplay we basically have a locked 60 FPS practically at all times. It is only when we enter some of the bonus stages that we begin to see frame rate drops down from this 60 FPS lock. However, the worst affected areas are these software rendered 3D Chaos Emerald bonus stages. Even on my 8700K, I was only able to attain between 10 and 29 FPS in any of these areas. Hopefully with future optimization, this game will be in a much more playable state. Next up, let's take a quick look at Stardew Valley. Unfortunately, at time of making this video, while Stardew Valley does in fact go in-game, it has a fairly significant issue. As you can see with the input, it constantly switches between your different items, and it also suffers from an issue with dynamic FPS. As you can see, the time of day is passing rather rapidly. This is not due to a very fast frame rate, it is unfortunately due to some kind of timer issue in this emulator itself. Hopefully in the coming days and weeks, this issue can be easily ironed out. Next up, let's take a look at Super Meat Boy. While this title boots and loads to its initial title menu, it still suffers with some fairly significant texture issues. While it's great to see one of my favourite platforming games booting in this emulator, hopefully they will be able to fix these rendering issues in the coming weeks. Let's close this video out with another fan favourite, The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus. This title currently boots, loads into game and performs at a fairly consistent 45 to 60 FPS. The only issue I have found upon playing this game for several hours now is the fact that when certain enemies get set on fire, they do not render correctly. This issue, however, is very minor, and I have absolutely no doubt that the developers of this emulator will have it solved in no time at all. So that's about it for this compatibility and performance update on Yuzu, this Nintendo Switch emulator. If you have any questions about any additional game compatibility on this emulator, do not hesitate to leave a comment down below. Once again guys, cheers for checking out the video. If you liked this video, please do give it a like rating down below. If you disliked it, give it a dislike, and as always, subscribe to the channel if you want to see all future videos from me.